It's rule breaking. That's the problem. The problem is not someone who's measuring their ego and their worth against a rival and feels bad when they lose.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Anthony Ellis, a classicist who decided to dip his toe into biblical studies, but not in the Greek area in the New Testament. He's reaching into the Hebrew Bible to do an analysis of the Hebrew word kina. It's a really interesting conversation to have because it's about human attributes, divine attributes. How do people understand those things? Is there a breakdown? Is there an attempt to change language and understandings that exists within the text because people want to engage the text in a certain way? Is that right? Is it okay? Or is it par for the course? So there's a lot left on the table for us to think about from the work that he's done. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Anthony Ellis. Anthony Ellis, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Get us going by letting us know who you are. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'll save you a list of my hobbies and tell you what I do work-wise, which is I do research on ancient Greek literature. That's my background in classics, so above all, ancient Greece and Rome. And what I've done most of my research in is ancient Greek religion and history. So I worked on Herodotus originally. And gradually, as time's gone on, I've been working on more themes that I guess are religious history more broadly, especially in Hebrew Bible, Septuagint, so the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and then moving forward into Judaism and Christianity in the ancient world. So that's the kind of stuff I work on. I did all my studies in Scotland, in Edinburgh, or almost all of them, and I've been at the University of Bern for the last 8 years.
Do you not want to talk about your hobbies? I'll hear about them if you want to talk about them.
I can tell you about, what should I say? I'll tell you about one hobby. I recently started making wine, which is really good fun actually, and tasty. Fortunately, so far, but it's always a bit of a gamble because we're leaving it up to nature. That all sounds very hippie, but we try to avoid. We just let the fermentation take place naturally. I'm doing it with a bunch of friends, and that means that the result can be pretty unpredictable. But that's like life. So
I knew some people about 10 years ago who were brewing their own beer, and it sounded like a pretty large-scale endeavor. How large-scale an endeavor is that?
it's much larger than one person would want to do by themselves. Let's put it that way. We're extremely small by comparison to most of the people I gather do this seriously, and we're very amateurish. But we're still using about 5,000 vines, and that makes, give or take, a bit less than 5,000 bottles, and it feels like a lot when you see the tanks. Yeah,
That's quite a hobby. My hobbies don't take up that much room.
the nice thing is that I'm doing it with it's not me who does it. It's a whole bunch of people in a kind of collective. So we share the work, and most of it falls on some fairly sturdy shoulders who are doing the majority of it. But yeah, it's a good project to do with friends.
Cool. I will. So I have a bunch of questions, but I will set those aside because that's not why you're here. You're here today to talk about your article, "The Rot of Bones: A New Analysis of Kin in the Hebrew Bible." Am I pronouncing that correctly? One, and two, if not, please correct me.
No, that's absolutely right. As I said, I'm no Hebrew philologist by training. I've come to this kind of from the outside, but as far as I understand it, kina would be the standard pronunciation. Biblical Hebrew gets pronounced in most scholarly contexts in the way of modern Hebrew, but yeah, that would be the way, which means envy or jealousy, as I argue in the article. So, just to give some context.
So that is your thesis, but you're saying it's a new analysis. So what, other than happening after someone else's, what sets your analysis apart to make it a new analysis?
Yeah, it's not particularly interesting to people who aren't already engaged in the debate to say this is new. So let me just tell you what I'm really arguing for in this piece. I feel like the main thrust of this argument is an attempt to understand a fairly important part of the Hebrew emotional furniture better than we have done to date. And so the word kina is conventionally translated as envy or jealousy. But if you bore down a little deeper and you look beyond the first two words, you'll often find a whole load of other words which are also given as translations: anger, passion, sometimes love, sometimes zeal. And it's a word which, although it's obviously for a long time been associated with envy and jealousy, has also attracted statements like this is actually an incredibly broad emotion. It can mean, depending on the context, almost any state of emotional arousal. And that's what I'm arguing is not correct. I think people have missed the nub, the emotional nub of the conceptual core of this emotion in scholarship to date for several reasons. One is because it's quite difficult. The other is that it's very theologically loaded. This is the emotion that God feels very prominently in very prominent passages in the Bible. God feels this emotion more than anyone else feels it. So it's a very theological emotion and also a very interesting one and complicated. So my attempt is to just bring it a little bit more into focus and to provide a new analysis of what that word means.
Okay, so where should we begin as far as like a biblical passage that you would look at to say, here's why I'm saying what I'm saying, and then what's a passage that you would point us to say, this is what has made it difficult for people to say what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's okay. That's a passage-based way of doing this is smart. I would say the first place we need to start is with English envy and jealousy, because we need to have a feeling for what those are before we come up with any theory about how to translate it into English. And obviously, we all have an instinctive sense of what envy and jealousy mean, but it's worth laying it open and verbalizing that. The way that I think a very good way of thinking about emotions is to, and making explicit all of the stuff that is within them, is to think about an emotion scenario as a kind of a little story, a script, which can have different variations, but which have some kind of coherence within them. So let's take, for instance, let's assume my car breaks down, and that makes me very emotional. Now, there might be various different types of emotion that I feel. I might be angry that the mechanic failed to fix it for a third time. I might be relieved that I don't have to go to this event that I was supposed to go to. I might feel ashamed that I won't be there for my friend at the support them in this crucial moment, which I was going to go and take part in. There are all sorts of emotions that I might feel there. And when we say that someone feels ashamed, that they feel angry, that they feel upset, sad, happy, relieved, we are embedding a lot of information in those words. And as the listener, you can understand, for instance, that if I say I'm angry at the mechanic, that I mean, okay, the mechanic has done something which I don't think is good. I'm very stressed about it, and probably you can have some field of what I'm likely to do as a result. Maybe I'll call up and shout at the guy. Maybe I'll go back or maybe I'll tell other people that he doesn't do a good job, or write a bad TripAdvisor review, whatever it is. Now, what the script approach basically does is to throw all of that out onto the table and just make it explicit. So you might say, we could break it down into several components. Let's say at the broadest level, the before, the during, and the after. What are the conditions out of which my emotion arises? With anger, it might be, I see that you have done something, I think that's wrong. Then what happens to me in the moment? So psychic, somatic experiences, some feeling of whatever it is, mental anguish, a feeling of elation and knot in the stomach, sweaty palms. And then the final thing is, what does it make you do? Does it make you go out and get aggressive? Does it make you weep with joy? Does it make you go off and try and explain to people why what you did was really the right thing? Or so once you take these different aspects out, you can really dial down on what emotion words are doing. And now if we look at envy and jealousy, and try and think about what sets them apart, then we get to an emotion which is extremely primal in human experience. Probably everybody has it in every society, even if languages talk about it quite differently. So envy and jealousy, we wouldn't say if my car broke down that I got jealous unless we were assuming certain aspects of the scenario, like there's someone else who's getting something that I'm not. So if I was on the way to pick up someone to take them to the high school dance, and now someone else is going to take them, then maybe we would start to say, that's why he's beating the ground, because he's jealous. Or if it was on the way to this concert, which I absolutely wanted to go to with all my friends, and we were going to go and meet the band, and it's this one-time opportunity, and they're all going to get to do it, and I'm not, then maybe you'd say I'm envious of them. But you wouldn't say the mechanic didn't fix my car, and that's why I'm really jealous. That doesn't really add up. So what makes envy and jealousy special in the broader emotional realm is that they are emotions which are to do with comparing yourself to rivals, comparing yourself to other people who have more than they did, more than you do. And when that makes you feel bad, that's when we talk about envy and jealousy. So they're quite specific emotions. They often co-occur with emotions like anger, rage. If you read descriptions of jealousy or envy, people will often also talk about anger in the same breath. But the inverse isn't true. So when you're angry, people don't typically say, oh yeah, you're envious. That doesn't really happen. Envy and jealousy don't come up in an anger scenario. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a helpful walkthrough of one of those things that it's easy to take for granted. One of those, I can't tell you what it means, but I'll know it when I see it, or just give a rough understanding of what a word like envy or jealousy is, because they are so common.
Absolutely. And very social. These emotions are usually about people. The story that fear is something which comes out when I don't know, some tiger jumps out at you at primal humans in a jungle, that's what fear is. But actually, when you look at most of the emotions that most of us feel most of the time, they're about regulating our social world around us. They're very strong, intense episodes which have a huge influence. They help us navigate our social world at a kind of unconscious level.
I think particularly with jealousy and envy, and this may be anachronistic to the texts that you're dealing with, maybe not though. They're not really at the center of a narrative that anybody wants to have about themselves.
Absolutely.
We tend to want to avoid those kinds of things. So in the theological sense of attributing anger and jealousy to God, even when that word, I'm a jealous God, even when that word actually comes out in an English translation of the Bible, there's a bit of tap dancing around that. Well, but it means it's a little bit more, it's different, it's sophisticated or something like that. So what text would you point us to say, hey, let's start looking at this?
Okay. So I suppose there's a question, do you want to get theological or do you want to stick on the human plane? Because that makes a big difference.
I want to go wherever you want to take us.
Okay. Let's start with the story of Joseph and his brothers. That's maybe a good example.
Okay.
That's a very social case of envy. So we're in Genesis. It's the story of two parents with lots of children, and the youngest is the dad's favorite. And Jacob loves Joseph more than he loves the rest. And the rest of the siblings hate Joseph first, and then slightly later it says that they feel kina, envy or jealousy at Joseph. What do? They make a plot. The plot is to take him off into the desert on a hunting trip and to kill him, and then claim he was killed by a wild animal. In the end, one of them gets an attack for conscience, and he just ends up getting sold into slavery. So it's slightly played down, but this, I think, takes us to the core of why many, in fact, probably all ethical traditions which have a view on envy and jealousy tends to view it in very negative terms. But if we just run a script approach on that story, then we get some pretty simple stuff. The siblings absolutely resent being loved less by their parent. It's associated with hate. We don't have any direct description of the way it makes them feel, but it's presumably pretty strong. We have somewhere else two sisters, Leah and Rachel, when they're envious of when one has children and the other wants children, she goes and confronts her husband and says, "Give me children or I will die." So this can be a pretty existential feeling among people, obviously, in the imaginary world of the Hebrew Bible. But in this story, there is no description of how it feels in the moment. But what do? They go off and plot to kill their brother. So it's an emotion which is about comparison, about difference. As usual, it's at that special point of similarity and dissimilarity. They're all brothers, they're all boys, they're all children of the same parents. They, in a way, would expect the same thing, but one has more. So they're very similar, they're peers, they're comparable, but there's inequality there. And that makes them feel bad. And what do? They don't try and make themselves better. They don't go and try and be extra virtuous or be really nice to their dad or whatever it is. They try to bring down the rival, which is probably the most common thing that people do in the Hebrew Bible. It's most envy and jealousy ends up tipping into violent action, sometimes slander, sometimes harming people. Yeah. So that's a good narrative to exemplify some of the aspects of envy and jealousy. And yeah, just to touch on something you brought up before, there is this very strong impulse in the Hebrew Bible to look down on envy and jealousy, on kina. I don't want to beg the question by translating the Hebrew into English at all cases, so I'll just talk about kina. But that is an emotion which wisdom literature says you shouldn't feel it. You should try and avoid it. It's the sign of a fool. It's the kind of emotion which rots your bones. It destroys you. And you can find those kind of similar comments in many other traditions as well.
Is the word kina, does that appear in the Cain and Abel story?
It doesn't, but it's the classic story, actually. That's where you expect, you always think that it will be there, and it appears in most of the paraphrases that God favors Abel, and that really makes Cain hurt, and that's why he goes and kills him. But it doesn't actually come up there in the Hebrew text.
Because I'm thinking, at least, okay, so the Joseph story, from a relatability standpoint, it does not scan. Like, I as an individual can't relate, even though I'll admit I felt jealous or envious of people for things that they've gotten that I didn't, certainly as a child. But from the show don't tell point of view of, hey, a basic creative writing, like, we're showing that these guys are really upset, but also showing that this is an emotional state that set them out of control. Because if, let's just throw him in a pit and leave him there, is, if that's splitting the difference for you, it's a pretty drastic set of circumstances to find yourself in. So I guess I hadn't really considered the wisdom literature aspect of this. So so taking this story of Joseph and his brothers, I think later in the story, Joseph actually does exemplify a wise man, right?
Mm-hmm.
A wise and capable public servant, I guess we could characterize him as now. And his brothers are just on their heels the whole time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something there to be gleaned from that juxtaposition?
So let's say, if you want to relate that to the wisdom tradition, if you're looking for moral in the story, which of course is possible to do in so many different ways depending on how you approach it, but I think there's a morality which is implicit in the narrative, which is the people who feel envy and jealousy don't come off. They do horrible things, and the person they do them to is much better and doesn't requite them in quite the same way. So yeah, Joseph comes off well, and Joseph is not the jealous one. So I think there is an implicit teaching on envy and jealousy in that story, even if it's not couched in quite the explicit way that you'll find it in, say, Proverbs or in some of the speeches in Job or something like that.
So from a moral or ethical or wisdom standpoint, are there instances where the word kina is invoked and it's not as detrimental to the person, talking about human characters now, that it's not as detrimental as in this case? Maybe that question doesn't make sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. So I haven't found any. That's one of the things that I was interested to find, and which I talk about in this article. There's a long tradition of saying kina can be good, it can be bad, depending on circumstances. Sometimes it means like nasty things like envy and jealousy. Sometimes it just means more like a benevolent passion, which is associated with love, and it's a good thing. And I think most of that comes not from actually looking hard at the way the word is used in human contexts, but from looking at the fact that it's ascribed to God and assuming that means that it's not a bad thing. And once you start to dive into the theological realm, you get into a whole bucket of worms, which I'm sure we will get into. But it's when you stick on the human plane, it's pretty clear. The bad guys feel, and wisdom tradition warns you not to feel it. There is perhaps one case that's an exception in Hebrew culture, which I think we can probably relate to in modern Western culture, which is romantic jealousy. So let me preface this by saying this. As like in most societies, you'll find a majority of people who think that it's perfectly acceptable to do horrible things to other people, by which I mean things like depriving them of their possessions, destroying their career, killing them, depriving them of their liberty, but only under the right circumstances, protecting other people, punishing them for transgression. Under all these circumstances, it would be perfectly normal for the legal system to lock people up, confiscate their goods, kill them, stop them practicing their career and doing what they want. But those are very specific circumstances, which is transgression of really important rules. And we tend to think that doing that is ideally done impartially, but there are sometimes emotions which are associated with that. And those would tend to be things like indignation, righteous anger, right? We can imagine people visiting a dreadful but just punishment on someone in a state of anger. And that's quite common in a lot of narratives as well. So that's let's say a good emotional state or an acceptable emotional state in which to do horrible things to people, for it to be a motivation for horrible things. Anger at someone having done something wrong. Envy and jealousy are they're just not good reasons. So the fact that your success makes me feel bad, that I want to have more than you, that it threatens my ego to see you having this reputation, having the glory for something that you've done, that's not a good reason to destroy someone. And almost no culture takes that to be socially acceptable. Now, we come to the exception, which is in romantic jealousy, there is a bit of a caveat there. And that's where it gets more interesting. And I think it's also very related to the whole question of monotheism and monogamy. We can talk about that later if you want, but there is a very strong sensation in many cultures that jealousy over your spouse is legitimate. So if you see your spouse transgressing the limits of what's acceptable for spousal behavior, which is obviously drawn differently in every culture, then that's jealousy, and it's also justified. You see what I mean? So that jealousy, I think, is an outlier romantic jealousy is an outlier on the broader spectrum of envy and jealousy in ethical thought. Jealousy can sometimes be justified in many people's ideas. Transpose that to friendship, and people would typically say that the same behavior is absolutely unjustified. A friend makes friends with someone else and is having a very nice time with that person, and going over and confronting your friend and saying, you never should talk to that person again, would not be something that most people would say, yeah, that's reasonable social behavior for adults. That's the kind of childish behavior we try and train people out of. But in a romantic sphere, it's typically much more acceptable. So there is, that's perhaps one of the reasons why envy and jealousy is basically cross-culturally looked down upon in many contexts, in almost every ethical tradition. It's just a bad reason to be horrible to people.
I'm interested in this marital analogy. Yeah, I do want to hear. So the monogamy, you said monogamy monotheistic, but it's not really monotheistic to say like you're worshiping these other gods, right?
That's a whole other can of worms, which we can get into.
So monogamy, monolatrous, monogamous, whatever people want to call it,
Sure.
Okay, so is that where we start to see kina being used in reference to God or Adonai or however you want to put it?
Yeah, so when it comes to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the word kina comes up most. Like it comes up. The word kina comes up in all about 85 times in the texts, which are today part of the Hebrew Bible, and more than half of those are in reference to God. So God is the big jealous one in this narrative, in this long collection of texts, and it's particularly in the Pentateuch, in the Deuteronomistic literature, so Deuteronomy, Numbers, where we find this idea incredibly prominent in the Ten Commandments, all the way through these narratives of Israelites crimes and divine punishment. And there it's very clear. It's say the simple case. There are cases of divine jealousy which are much harder, let's say, which have caused much more problems. But it's very clear that the problem is you worship other gods, but I'm your God. So that makes me jealous. So it's effectively, it's idolatry or the worship of rival deities that causes Yahweh to get jealous. Now, there are other passages in the prophets which interpret divine jealousy differently, and we can talk about those. But that's what, in its original context, we would most naturally think of as historicizing it. This is a demand for monolatry, so the worship of just your God and not the worship of other gods. But obviously, in the later tradition, Jews and Christians think of themselves very strongly. It's a strong part of their identity claim that they are monotheists, that they only believe that one God exists, that they believe that only one God exists. And this is, whether you actually want to historicize it and say it's not monotheistic, that's one question. But in the later tradition, it counts for monotheism. And that's where divine jealousy presents a stumbling block. I don't know if you want to talk about Gamliel, who has a really interesting, it's a difficult question and gives a very interesting answer. So
Go ahead.
I think the best thing for me to do is actually read you the story. It's a great little parable. So this is about Gamliel. It doesn't say which Gamliel, but it could be the elder or the younger, but we're talking about someone probably, the historical setting is 1st century CE probably, and we're dealing with possibly the figure who Paul says in Acts was his teacher, Gamliel the Pharisee, and who in the rabbinic tradition is a rabbi. And this is a Hebrew story from late antiquity, from the Mekilta de Rabbi Yismael, and it runs like this. A philosopher, probably a Greek philosopher, asked Rabbi Gamliel, "It's written in your Torah, 'For I am the eternal, your God, a jealous God.' Now," continues the philosopher, "does an idol have the power to arouse jealousy against itself? The hero is jealous of the hero. The sage is jealous of the sage, the rich man of the rich man. So does an idol have the power to arouse jealousy against itself?" And he, Rabbi Gamliel, said to him, "If someone calls his dog by his father's name, and when he takes an oath, he does so by the life of this dog, at whom does the father feel kina? At the son or the dog?" So it needs a bit of unpacking. It's a pretty dense narrative, but it's actually spectacular once you realize what he's doing. And the script approach will help us here. So the philosopher basically comes with this kind of needling point, which says, you say there's only one God, but people feel jealousy at people who are like them. They feel jealousy at their peers, or they feel kina at their peers. So hero feels it at hero, sage at sage. A rich person doesn't get jealous of the sage for having more knowledge than him. The rich person measures himself against another rich person. People separate themselves into these peer groups. So if God's getting jealous at idols, then presumably they're not just dead pieces of wood. Presumably they are actually gods. So he's, in a sense, I think there is an implicit attempt to read the Bible against itself to solve a problem which obviously some people felt was there, which is if God's jealous, then he's not the only one. Now, the second part, Gamliel's answer to this is great. He says, okay, it's a slightly odd analogy, but he says, consider this. If someone calls his dog by his father's name and then he swears an oath by the life of his dog, who does the father feel kina at? The implicit answer is obviously not at the dog. The father doesn't feel jealous of the dog. He doesn't feel like the dog is a rival father to him who's doing a better job. The dog is irrelevant. The dog is just this insentient four-legged beast. The person who's misbehaved is the son. The son has disrespected his father, which, as we know from biblical commandments, you shouldn't do. And the son is taking his father's name in vain. The father doesn't feel jealous at the dog. He feels anger at the son for doing things wrong. So Gamliel's way of dealing with this story is basically to say, if I paraphrase, it's not jealousy, it's anger. It's righteous indignation. And it's not felt at a rival, which is the criterion for jealousy. It's felt at the person who's done the wrong thing. So the argument is basically God doesn't feel kina at other gods, his rivals who exist. Rather, God feels kina, which must mean contextually something like anger, at the Israelites for doing bad things. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I see that, and it resonates with the Hosea unfaithfulness resulting in judgment against the unfaithful one, not the one with whom they were unfaithful.
Right.
Okay.
So effectively, there the focus is really moved onto transgression of normative rules. It's rule breaking, right? That's the problem. The problem is not someone who's measuring their ego and their worth against a rival and feels bad when they lose. So Gamliel kind of engages in the most like subtle of rewrites, which is always exegesis. You take the story and you don't like what it says, and so you work out how you can retell it, reframe the narrative for it to mean something which is closer to what you think must be true. And he's doing that with Hebrew, right? But if you look at his contemporaries, or like the contemporaries of the historical Gamliel, Philo, Josephus, you notice that the whole concept of divine jealousy is gone. It's just not there. They don't use it at all. When Josephus paraphrases the Ten Commandments, so this is a Jewish priest, 1st century CE, he leaves out the statement, you shouldn't worship other gods, for I am a jealous God. When he tells all these narratives of idolatry and crime, he has no recourse to any statement of divine jealousy, but he has God getting angry a lot. So because he's got the liberty of translating it from one language into another, he can just come out with it and leave and translate kina as orge or some other word, like some other Greek anger word. But Gamliel has to work. He's reading the Bible in Hebrew, talking about it in Hebrew. And so he has to find another way of seeing that scenario, which basically stops it being envy or jealousy. So you see what's happened there. There's a kind of perfidious shift that's taken place, where Gamliel says, yeah, of course, it's kina. God feels kina. But if you really understand what kina is, it isn't jealousy. He doesn't say it's not kina, but he reframes jealousy to mean something different than what it naturally means, which is what the philosopher comes with. You see what I mean?
So there's a terrestrial understanding of this word that if you use it in regards to any person, it means this. And now you have a new notional layer added on top of that to create a theological assertion.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. People are struggling with the fact that probably the most disreputable emotion in the whole palette of human emotions is being presented in central books and passages in the Bible as the central emotion of God. At one point, it's said explicitly, his very name is jealousy, is jealous, kana. And that's a difficult thing to deal with when you have a negative view of jealousy and a positive view of God. Now, of course, if we put it back in its historical context, it's an absolutely fantastic anthropomorphism. It's a way of saying, right, just so you get how serious this is, imagine that God is one of several rivals and really jealous. just don't do it. Don't go and worship the other ones because he will destroy you. And that's the way that these narratives unfold. Divine jealousy is associated with fiery anger and usually terrible destructive consequences for the Israelites. Sometimes plagues, sometimes it's always cataclysmic, often is defeat at the hands of their enemies. And it's a simple anthropomorphism that very effectively communicates what's really unique about Yahweh, which is that he doesn't tolerate other, let's say, his peers. He doesn't tolerate the worship of other gods by his people. So it works in its context in a sense. But once you move into a later tradition, which is philosophizing, which is thinking about the way that God should be, seeing God as supreme, unique, absolutely untouchable, incomparable, outside time and space, without emotions, without change, then you look at this and you think, what? The worst of human vices as the central emotion that God feels? Give me a break. And you look for other ways of reading it. So it makes sense, I think. And Gamaliel, it's really ingenious as well, because he keeps the word there, but he shifts the interpretation so that it no longer means what it normally means.
So are there interpreters who deal with texts where kina appears that are approaching it the way that you are, which I would say is arguably better exegesis, because otherwise you are reading into the text if you're not reading this word the way that you would read it in its broadest context, right?
So I'd say two things to that. Firstly, this isn't really a problem. There is no problem which can't be solved by exegesis. That's the wonderful thing about exegesis, right? If the the way that people approach biblical exegesis is perfectly sufficient to deal with this according to the same criteria. So the whole idea of divine anthropomorphism is rejected by many biblical interpreters who just don't think that God's like a human, doesn't feel human emotions, doesn't have hands and feet, doesn't have a belly, doesn't eat food, doesn't walk around. This is sort of pretty basic stuff for most interpreters, and they think that the reason why God's talked about as having feet and sending out his hand and so on is because we don't have the language to talk about God. We have language which we apply to all the things around us that we can see and feel. And when we need to talk about something which we've never seen and which is extremely difficult to comprehend, we transfer the language from what we can see and we use it for something else. But that doesn't mean that it's exactly the same. And there's that tension between divine anthropomorphism and its opposite, which runs throughout the Bible itself and later on. So it's perfectly easy to say, look, hey, this is just a metaphor. This is just trying to capture one element of the way God behaves. But yeah, at the same time, even if that exegetical option's open, most people haven't taken that. They've taken the other option, which is to say, hey, look, if you look at it hard enough, kina basically means anger, or it means love, or it means passion, because that's a more superficially, in a sense, it feels like a simpler road. And there are reasons why that's happened. We can talk about those.
What
The
are they?
second thing, yeah,
Oh, I'm
well,
sorry.
so
Go ahead.
there are two. There are two reasons. Sorry, I feel like I'm putting up an accordion here. But the second thing I wanted to say was that I don't remember what the second thing I wanted to say was, but
I'm sorry.
the two other things. No, that's all right. So the reasons why it's happened are basically twofold. Let's see if I get to number two this time. It's the first one is that you've got a changing linguistic situation, which is something we can see from later texts written in Hebrew. The word kina basically changes its meaning, or at least it gains other meanings alongside the basic sense of envy and jealousy over the course of several centuries. And by the time the texts in Qumran were written, we can see it being used in other ways. So that opens up other ways of reading the texts for people who are looking back at them. The second one is language change in another sense, which is grammatical. Okay, for this, we need to talk about something called vicarious jealousy. Does that mean anything to you?
I think I know what those two, like jealousy on someone else's behalf.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, I don't know what your feeling is. Do you feel like this is a an emotion that you've ever felt or an emotion that makes instinctive sense to you?
As a parent, yes. I definitely feel things on behalf of another person. I don't know that I would ever say I've felt jealous, but I wasn't prepared for that question, so I didn't put a ton of thought into it.
No, my instinct's pretty similar to yours, which is that it makes sense. You can see that this is an emotional experience available to us, but it's not something we really talk about in English, and that's what's different in Hebrew, and that's where language difference comes in. So when I talk about vicarious jealousy, I'm talking about something like, I don't know, your favorite football team and the captain is at the awards ceremony and was sure that they were going to get the best award for the best team in the season. And then it goes to the other captain at the last minute. And you can just feel the envy dripping off this captain as he watches someone else go up and take the trophy he wanted. And you feel that too. Now, you can imagine this kind of scenario, or kids, maybe to take your example and spin it around, kids watching their parents compete at sports days. They want their parents to win, and they're on the same side as their parents, and there's this collective glory, and the people you care about, you want them to succeed. And when they don't, and their rivals succeed instead, you feel bad about it. And it can often motivate the same kind of behavior that envy and jealousy would motivate on your own behalf. You can imagine parents trying to, I don't know, say mean things to the kids on the other side who are going to compete against their kids because they want their kids' team to win. This kind of stuff. Humans are doing this all the time, but we don't typically talk about vicarious. We don't say, oh, I felt so jealous for you. I felt really envious for you. But you could say it and we'd understand what you mean if you said it. Now, in Hebrew, by contrast, people do say that. Not a whole bunch of times, but given that we have, as I said, like about 35 instances in the Hebrew Bible where humans feel the fact that it comes up 3 or 4 times is actually a fairly big proportion. And it comes up more than that if you include what we'll call theological jealousy. But I'm going to leave that to one side for the moment. So here, this takes us to another passage, which is, okay, we're in the book of Numbers, and it's Joshua, son of Nun, right? So this is the guy who will eventually take over the role of Moses as chief prophet and leader of the Israelites and lead them back into the promised land. But Joshua is at this point still a young guy, and he's not taken over by any means. He's Moses' kind of servant helper. And it's a great passage, right? So Moses feels overwhelmed with the burden of responsibility on his shoulders. And he says to God, I can't deal with it. I need to share it. And God says, bring all the 70 elders to the tent of meeting, and my spirit will descend upon them. And the idea is that they'll help him shoulder the burden. Now, it doesn't go exactly as everyone expected, because God's spirit also goes down to 2 people who aren't in the tent of meeting, who aren't in that 70, presumably, Eldad and Medad. And God's spirit also descends on them and they start prophesying. People run up to the tent of meeting and say, hey, these guys are prophesying too. And Joshua says, stop them. And Moses rounds on him and says, are you feeling jealous for me? The word for me is li, so it's the preposition le, which usually means 2 or 4, the lamed preposition. And then he basically says, you've got it completely wrong, Joshua. If I could, I would have God's spirit descend on all of the Israelites. This is a good thing that's happening. So in this scenario, basically what you have is someone who's very strongly linked to Moses. He's really on his side and is seeing this as some kind of rivalry scenario which has got out of control. These guys are trying to take something away from Moses, and he says, pull the plug. And Moses says, no, you're feeling jealous on my behalf, but you've got it wrong. This is vicarious jealousy. Now, we can talk about what happens to that scenario as you read it in later periods. But before we do that, the really important thing is that vicarious jealousy is a hugely important theological notion within the Hebrew Bible itself, and it gets only more important in the later tradition. So for whom people most often feel vicariously jealous is God. Put more succinctly, people get jealous for God quite a lot, and they get jealous for God in exactly the same circumstances where God would get jealous. So when God would feel jealous because you're worshipping rival gods. True Israelites, when they see their fellow Israelites misbehaving like this, they feel God's jealousy. They internalize it. They feel it for God. And that makes them behave in pretty comparable ways to the way God behaves, which is trying to kill the people involved. The killing of the apostate. That's vicarious jealousy. And it comes up in a couple of just raw human scenarios, but it's most often, it's Phineas, it's Elijah, it's Yehu, it's the priests, the kings, and the prophets of the Pentateuch and the historical books who feel this emotion for God and who get praised for feeling it, because that's the way you should feel.
Okay, so things take a left turn here where kina is looked down upon, except in these cases, or in the cases where it's descriptive of God, because it doesn't mean what it means otherwise. Are there times when divine kina is vicarious?
So as you can see, you've got all these different types of scenario opening up and multiplying, and it gets quite complicated because you can feel jealousy at someone, you can feel jealousy for someone on someone's behalf at someone else, and then they can feel it back for you. So God also feels jealousy for his people. And when does he feel jealousy for his people? When they're getting the stuff kicked out of them by their enemies. So when the Israelites suffer, then God gets jealous on their behalf and intervenes and shovels them up and supports them and repulses the enemy. So this is something that comes up. It comes up in that sense that we just described, God getting jealous on behalf of the Israelites. That only comes up in prophetic literature, with one exception with a passage which is in both Isaiah and Kings, 2 Kings, I think. That passage, yeah. So the prophetic vision of divine jealousy, and especially in the minor prophets, is much better for Israel. It starts to look good. It's what God feels when the Israelites are suffering, and they've suffered enough. They're usually suffering because they did something wrong and he's punishing them. And then once they've suffered enough, he starts to feel jealous on their behalf because they're being beaten by their rivals. And then he intervenes. And it becomes this kind of salvific force. So you get people saying, this is in Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, I think, where is your kina? And asking God to put on praying for its presence, basically. Kina has now turned a corner and become a force a divine force, a divine emotion which helps Israel. Look back at the Pentateuch, however, you don't find that at all. You only find God's jealousy coming in when on his own behalf. So you only find God getting jealous because you worship rival gods. That's, to me, it seems like the more intuitive sense, and that's what I think most people are thinking of. Now, do you want to know why this becomes such a sticking point in the latest tradition?
Of course I do.
Sorry, that was a leading question. So what happens is two very complicated things, and they're not complicated in themselves, but they lead to a huge amount of confusion. Now, I told you that the word used in a vicarious jealousy scenario is for, right? Le. It's a preposition. It's a one-letter preposition. The letter is lamed, and pronounced it's le. This is the way you say, I feel jealousy. Joshua felt jealousy le Moses, right? That would be the way you say it. Joshua felt jealousy on Moses' behalf. Phineas felt kina le Yahweh, felt jealousy on Yahweh's behalf, and so intervened for him. Now, what happens is that in later biblical Hebrew, in Aramaic, which is increasingly spoken instead of Hebrew, le doesn't mean to or for. It indicates the indirect object. So it's like an accusative in languages with a case system. And let's say that means something like at, if you had to translate that into English. So a distinction which is being made in earlier biblical Hebrew between feeling jealousy on someone's behalf and feeling jealousy at someone totally breaks down. Because if you're an Aramaic speaker who reads the Bible, but whose knowledge of the Bible is of those early phases of the language is primarily from just reading sacred scripture, and you speak a related but different language, and to you the word that means on someone's behalf means at them, then that whole distinction kind of breaks down. And what goes wrong is this. This is my best reconstruction of what happens. People no longer think that someone like Joshua is feeling jealousy on Moses' behalf because they see him losing to his rivals. They think that he's feeling an emotion at Moses. So Joshua's kina is no longer hostility directed at Moses' rivals. It's something directed at Moses. And if you just contextually trying to think, what would that be? It's got to be something positive. It's got to be something like love. It's got to be something like devotion. So suddenly you have, and the same thing with Yahweh, right? So when Yahweh feels kina for his people, read through, let's say, an Aramaicizing syntax, that means he feels kina at Israel. And what does he do? He helps them. So kina suddenly becomes this much broader concept, which can be directed at your rivals and makes you destroy them, but it can also be directed at your closest associates, your allies, your God, your leader, your people, which makes you support them. And this is, for me, the root of the misunderstanding that kina basically means any emotion you can shake a stick at: passion, anger, love, and also envy and jealousy. Because the vicariousness of the scenario hasn't been properly understood, and so you have to adjust your understanding of the core of the emotion. You see what I'm saying?
I do. Here's what's really interesting about this to me. And I think you can see this in day-to-day life and the way that you communicate. There are really simple, basic meanings and understandings of words and concepts that we take for granted. And then there are situations and relationships that we try to preserve from those really simple meanings. Like profane, that's the word that I'm dancing at. There are profane meanings, and then there are really common relationships that we try to protect from the profane, even though they're also common. And it really just speaks to how complex our relationships and our communication is. And then when you stretch that out over years or decades or centuries or millennia, and like people I've never met and will never meet who spoke languages that are like a version of a language that we still kind of know, it's, man, there's so much going on there. I know that's just such an amateurish way of describing that, but I'm an amateur, so I get to do that.
You're absolutely right. I think it's something that's very particularly fascinating about Bible translation, about Bible's scriptures and the way that they move through time. They just have this long durée to them that is comparable only in some other traditions, but the volume of material and the depth of engagement is just beyond anything that you encounter, for instance, as a classicist. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And that makes Bibles one of the most fascinating tools to work with historically. So this is something that's always struck me, actually, over the last few years as I've been working more and more with Bible translations. If you're interested in, for instance, the jealousy language of, I don't know what, medieval German, of early modern French, of contemporary Swahili, of ancient Greece, what you can do is something really interesting, which is you can take a biblical narrative and you can look for where the words that you're interested in come up. And then you can look sideways and you can look to the same verse and the same point in the same verse in any of the languages into which the Bible's been translated. And that's an unbelievable number of languages, in the thousands, and also all the way back through the past. And what you also find is that the Bible is this kind of homogenizing force, because there are all these narratives, like scripts, like we talked about before, in which you need to put a word. The Bible requires you to put a word with it, the semantic shape of a Hebrew word in there. And you need to feed in a word from the vernacular which fits that shape. And that means that you can basically turn across any century in language and compare the way that different languages treat the same kind of scenario. Which the Bibles are like sort of cultural wormholes. And the other really strange thing is that because Bibles take on such an importance, they end up changing the languages that they're translated into. Luther's Bible is probably the best example, but the King James Version or Tyndale's Bible in English do the same thing. So the really weird things which they do, because they can't find a solution to a translation problem, end up setting the norm for subsequent generations of native speakers. Yeah, so Bibles and their interwoven nature in the rest of the linguistic historical tradition is a huge and fascinating topic. So I share your awe at that.
I feel like you just explained to me why I started my podcast, because there's so much transdisciplinary approaches. What a terrible sentence I just constructed right there. There are so many transdisciplinary approaches and subjects and angles of entry that you can use to try and better understand this collection of texts, which will also, I think, fold back into the culture that you approached it from your approach and then going onward. So looking at the time and seeing that we've been talking for about an hour and not wanting to keep you because it is significantly later for you than it is for me, what so far in the conversation, what was there in the article that you wanted to talk about that we haven't gotten to?
I think one thing that's important is, which I realize that we didn't get onto yet, is simply the incredible variety in the way that languages talk about the same things. And I think that's worth emphasizing. So the whole reason why it's worth, in my view, writing an article on what the Hebrew concept of kina means is that kina is not identical to any of the other words that you can find in any other language. Each language divides up the emotions into its own set of it's like its own prism. It's like a pie. Human emotional experience is one big cake, and you can slice it any which way. And different languages do that differently. And there are, let's say, pieces which correspond to each other across languages, but that correspondence is limited. And in some cases it's very good, and in some cases it's very bad. And with kina, it's very hard to translate that one-to-one into English. Maybe a better analogy is like every language is a wardrobe with its own set of clothes in it. And if you look at from one to another, you'll see that they have more or less the same things in it, right? You can dress a person using the clothes from one wardrobe or the other, and in many cases they'll look pretty much the same. But the size and the shape and the cut of those items within the wardrobe are different. Even if you can say they both have shirts and trousers and socks and dresses, maybe one has a onesie in it and the other one doesn't. The other one does it with trousers, suit, a matching suit. At the risk of pushing that metaphor too far, you find exactly the same thing in emotion research and more broadly with concepts across different languages, that even though they correspond to each other in a fairly loose way, and you can talk about any scenario in any language, you can tell a story in any language, and it will be recognizably the same story. But the actual building blocks out of which you have to construct that story are different. And when it comes to emotions, the variety is huge. And that makes debates like, is God jealous or envious? Which is something that gets rehashed a lot in, let's say, theological studies of kina. That means that you can't have that debate in English. You can have, of course you can have it in English, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible isn't using the words jealousy and envy. In fact, in Hebrew, what we call two words, the experiences which we slice up into two emotions, envy and jealousy, are all referred to by one emotion in Hebrew. In ancient Greek, it was referred to by three emotions. So if you want to come up with a view which is fairly common within the Christian tradition, which is in, let's say, a modern, I think it would be a standard modern dogmatic view and fairly common layperson view, which is that the devil feels envy, but God feels jealousy. And those are different emotions. You're going to have a hard time translating that back into biblical Hebrew or into ancient Greek, because they just talk about these emotions so differently. So that is where language comes in. And I think it's also why it's so important to drill down on what the concepts mean, especially in a human context where you are in some senses freed from the theological baggage which comes with discussing divine emotions. And you build up a detailed picture of the semantics and, let's say, the semantic shape of the concepts that we're dealing with in the language you're interested in, because that's the only way to understand what, let's say, divine jealousy means in the Hebrew Bible.
This occurred to me in another interview too, that the Star Trek universal translator model, I think, exists in a lot of our brains, and it's not technology that could or should exist. That we are all just walking around with earpieces in that will do an ad hoc job of translating something. This is something that needs to be poured over. And furthermore, for a text that is as important, okay, stripping out belief, which I'll put back in a second, taking these texts and engaging with them as academics do, it requires, when you go to SBL, yeah, people are disagreeing. I remember standing there in the lobby of a hotel where we had just a session had just finished, and I followed these two guys downstairs and they were arguing, and it was really cool to watch. And that's what their jobs are, is to like keep re-engaging and keep rehashing. And then you add on to that there are, I don't know, 2-3 billion people in the world, maybe 4, for whom biblical texts are significant in varying degrees. You should not treat that like Beowulf. And that's not to say that Beowulf is unimportant, but I don't know of anyone whose spiritual and intellectual and moral and ethical understanding of the world and the universe rests on Beowulf. So it's fine that there are just a handful of translations out there for that. And it's fine that most of us don't know how to read it in the original language and aren't concerned with what kind of redactional layers there might be there. But I think people should engage more with what the academic work on biblical texts is. And I appreciate that you are stepping across as a classicist into looking at biblical texts and being able to appreciate something there for your main discipline. So hats off to you there.
Thanks. It's extremely rewarding to talk about biblical texts because, as I say, there's just such a strong tradition of engagement, and they throw a really different light on many things. So Hebrew is a language which we have a large corpus of texts in from thousands of years ago, which preserves a way of talking about the world, which is very foreign to the way that we in, let's say, contemporary America or the UK talk about the world. And there is so much variety. Variety is, of course, the rule, but it's one of the ways to relativize and to understand just how local the way that we speak and think can be.
Where would you point people for reading or listening, YouTube, podcasts, books, blogs, whatever, on not just on this topic, but any topic that you want? Where would you send people?
Okay, that's a good question. On jealousy and envy, so the history of jealousy and envy is very hard to write because languages talk about these emotions so differently. And with the feeling that hadn't ever been done, that's what I'm trying to set out to do, to write a book on the history of jealousy and envy in no more than about half a dozen languages, but ones that have been very important in let's say Western European culture for the last couple of thousand years. So we're talking Hebrew, ancient Greek, Latin, and then the Romance languages and German, which are the Romance languages through, say, from Low Latin and the first emergence of the Romance languages in the medieval period through to the early modern period. And that's a really complicated story, and it's a story which I wanted to find out to be able to write this book that I'm writing on divine envy and jealousy. And I couldn't find it anywhere, and I kept realizing that without understanding what's going on, you basically can't tell the story properly that I was interested in finding out. So that's something that I'm going to try and do. There are some very nice books written on the iconography of envy and jealousy, which look at the way it's been presented in art, which look at there's really nice articles on metaphors for envy and jealousy, which have been used in multiple different languages. There's been comparisons of envy and jealousy language, maybe of two local languages, or of the way that envy and jealousy language works in a given culture. So what I've tried to do here with Hebrew has been done before in different ways, and has been done for Greek, has been done for medieval German, where there was no word for envy and jealousy. They've looked at how they would talk about these scenarios. So there's all sorts of local work, but there isn't much which brings everything together. And if you want, I can send you a list of stuff. We can put that up in the link somehow.
Absolutely.
Of
Yeah.
articles on envy and jealousy, because the history of envy and jealousy is absolutely fascinating, because it's such a universal experience. But at the moment, I would say it's fragmented. And then if you're interested in divine jealousy, there's some books which will discuss all the passages. They'll tell you totally different things to what I say, but they're an interesting read. So there's one by Renaud, written in the 60s, on envy and jealousy of God, which basically argues that it's a form of loving anger and passion. And then there are various lexical entries which discuss all the passages, and in most of what they say, I think is really good. Yeah, and if you're interested in biblical theology more broadly, interestingly, divine jealousy is a black spot in the scholarly literature. If you're interested in ancient Greek stuff, there's also very interesting things. So I suggest I'll send you a bibliography with some links. I haven't found any good podcasts on it yet, but I'm sure they must be out there. So
Well,
if
that's
I
because
track
this one
anything,
hasn't come out yet. What do you read for fun?
that's a good question. I have just been reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which I never read before, and I've enjoyed that. But what I read, literature, would be one of the things I read. I also read scholarship for fun a lot, and I read ancient texts like ancient Greek literature. Most recently, I've been reading Diogenes Laertius. That's pretty nerdy, but that's the lives of the ancient philosophers, and that's an absolutely fascinating account of how philosophers lived. It's a hodgepodge, and it's got a lot of funny stuff in it as well. But it's well worth a read. Yeah, it's
Well,
not a
that
laugh a minute.
what's that?
It's not a laugh a minute though. I can't
Not
recommend
everything has to
it.
be. Not everything has. I heard early stand-up comedians, because that's not a very old art form. They really confused vaudeville comedians, because vaudeville comedians were like, you shouldn't be going more than 2 minutes without a setup and a punchline. A laugh a minute is a pretty new concept. Hey, unless you have anything else for me, I feel comfortable calling this one good.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. It was very interesting to talk, and nice to be in conversation with you about this stuff. So thank you for having me on, and I look forward to hearing more podcasts. I've enjoyed the ones you've put up so far. So
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the downloads, and I watch those numbers. But thank you for being here even more than that. Take care.
Thank you.